So for our final session for the day, just like our earlier panel, there'll be an opportunity for you in the room to ask questions. So if you do have a question towards the end, pop your hand up and we'll come to you. We want to hear from as many people in the room. So I'd like to welcome back our speakers, Andrew Mosely, if you want to come up, Dr. Srividya Iyer, if you want to come up to the panel, and we have Richard, do you want to go back up as well? And we've got two special guests joining us for the panel. So we have Ariane Hermann. She's the first Assistant Secretary in the Cancer, Hearing and Chronic Conditions Division for Primary and Community Care Group in the Australian Department of Health and Aged Care. Give her a round of applause. We really appreciate having someone from the department. She began her career as a psychologist, and Ariane's held a number of senior roles across government, mental health reform, legal assistance and disaster recovery. And then our second special guest for the panel is Prashant Nikam. He's the Managing Director ANZ for MSD, with more than 20 years experience across new product development, and he's held lots of product launches in oncology, and his principle is that patients can't wait, and that's something you've been hearing a lot all day. So give them all a big round of applause and I'll come and join them. All right, don't forget to be thinking about questions that you might have, but I'm going to start with Ariane. We've been hearing we've got a new report out today from Rare Cancers that's got 4 recommendations of what we would like to see change. But we really appreciate you being here, because things don't happen unless we get everyone on board, and that includes government departments as well. When you get sent a report like the one we're releasing today, can you take us through what's the process for you from a federal health department point of view when you get a report like that, just so that we can know a bit more about the process, and how do you process something like that when you get a great organisation like us saying, oh, we've got this report, just tick off these 4 things and we'll be happy.
Sure. Well, firstly, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today. I think it's a pretty interesting week to be in Parliament House following the weekend. And I also just want to acknowledge all the researchers, clinicians and consumers, particularly the patients, because one of the things that is so important to us in the Canberra bubble, I call it, is actually hearing from people that are out there on the ground doing the work, and people that are moving through the system, and the experience of patients is really important. So when I got the copy of the verification report on my table, actually reading your story was incredible to me, to actually understand what it's like, and what it meant to me as well, hearing your story, is you're really well versed, highly educated, already knew a lot about the system, and being able to navigate the system was still challenging for you. And so imagine what it's like for all of the people that aren't. The report itself, so when a report comes in like that, and we get many, let's be clear, obviously the ones that we get from Rare Cancer and Richard, we have a really great working relationship with Richard's organisation. But so we get a copy of the report. Not everything in that report sits in my remit. I'm banging my mic, sorry. So I have to work right across my department with various areas that are responsible for elements in the report. So Genomics Australia, that's not with me, that sits in another area, so I need to go and talk to that area about what policies they're developing and what's happening in that space. I have to deal with my workforce area, so that there's lots of workforce policies that are driving changes around supporting pathologists, as Richard talked about. So it's kind of it's not a simple solution when reports like this come in. It actually takes the whole department, and sometimes even beyond the department. So you heard about Omico or Prospect. That's being done by a completely different area in government that we have to engage with on that as well. So I would work through all of those things, and then I start to think about, well, what are the things that we're already doing in response to those, to the recommendations of that report. So, I can briefly touch, I know the Minister spoke this morning, but when I read the verification report, I thought, well, that's okay, because there are a few things that we're doing in this space already, so it's not a surprise to us. Like, we know that there are things, particularly around personalised medicine in the future of cancer care, that we need to be looking at and driving a lot more in the system. And when I read the title of CanForum around Is Australia Ready? I thought, well, we better get ready, because it's already here and it's already happening.
Exactly, yeah. And I think that's sort of what we wanted to come through in the discussions today as well.
Yeah.
That, it's already happening, but it's also going to get be even more an issue going forward.
Yeah, and so the challenge for us, I think, in government is then how do we think about systematisation of genomics in cancer care across the whole spectrum? So, I think about research, I think about prevention and detection and treatment, and so lots of those bits of pieces don't sit with me as well. So it's thinking about how do I influence those pieces from a cancer perspective, because that's where my role really comes in, and chronic conditions. But how do I start to influence those other areas to start to really consider what this means for cancer? And I don't want to say we're lucky in cancer, because we're not, but cancer is leading the way on genomics. So in fact, actually our voice and my voice when I speak to my colleagues actually has quite a lot of strength to it, because we are leading the way in the cancer control system on the implementation of genomics in the medical system. Yeah. And
are there any particular challenges that are thrown up when you think about the sort of recommendations we've put in this report, that you or roadblocks that sort of might stop these fantastic recommendations being put into place?
That's a really good question. Cost is always one. So governments are always trying to weigh up many proposals that they get, and what is the best way to use public money. Equity of access for me is one of the really big ones that we're struggling with. And Richard mentioned the Australian Cancer Plan. It is coming soon, but fundamentally,
I emailed my ABC colleagues today saying, go and have a look, go and ask the department, when's the report coming?
It's coming soon. And look, fundamental to the Australian Cancer Plan is this idea of equity, and I think that's incredibly important when we think about rare cancers as well, is because we know at the moment that equity of care and equity of access, equity of treatment, it's not there.
Yeah, just because of the sheer nature of being a rare cancer, and we're going to talk about that. But I'll just go to Prashant. Thanks, Ariane. We'll go to Prashant. As you just heard from Richard, the report calls for a new pathway in health technology assessment that would allow what's known as pan-tumour registration, so a drug being registered for more than one tumour location, and subsidy as well. I want to ask Prashant, how feasible is that to have that happen, and what sort of difference would it make as well for patients?
No, thank you for this, and thank you to RCA for the invitation. Before I answer that question, I just wanted to share some reflection, and I shared this with Richard at lunch, that we are in a very rich country and we're sitting here and talking about these issues about access to medicine, access to genomics. I think it's very frustrating also, and I think it's very clear from everyone's conversation that so much needs to be done from all stakeholders, right? And I think one of the solutions is a pan-tumor listing or a pan-cancer kind of access solution. And I think it's very much feasible. I mean, clearly, when you look at genomics and the next-gen sequencing, you clearly understand that the tumor location or the histology is not important.
Less and less important.
Biology is more important. Yeah. We have many drugs across the spectrum in the industry, and they can work together to really address that. So I think the question is, how can we make that happen? How can we remove some of the barriers that Ariane talked about? Clearly, process, of course, gets in the way, because we have this mindset of population-based medicine, not precision medicine. So how do you shift our attention to precision medicine, get the process lined up? And then the second piece is access when it comes to HTA evaluation and how innovation is valued. Of course, cost is a big consideration, but we have to look at the problem holistically and say, how do we really look at value? Are we comfortable with the uncertainty? And all parties involved in this evaluation have to work together to make that happen. But I think the time is right. Solutions are there in the healthcare industry and the environment. We just have to make it happen.
Exactly. Richard, did you, before we move away from the issue of the pan-tumour registration, did you want to say anything? And you were talking yesterday, sharing the example of your wife Kate's cancer and how, when she was diagnosed, what the case was and how that hasn't improved.
Yeah, well, I think the case is, I mean, Kate's the reason you're all here, because it was Kate's diagnosis with medullary thyroid carcinoma that provoked us to set up Rare Cancers Australia. But it is a crushing reality that in 2012, when we established it, there were no drugs funded on the PBS, but there were a couple listed on the FDA. I think now there are either 4 or 5 on the FDA, but there are still no drugs funded.
So still no drugs in Australia for that.
And it's not an acceptable rationale to say, well, we've never had an application. If Andrew Wilson was here, he'd be tempted to say that, because I heard him say it before, bless him. But you can't build a system that has so many barriers that we have to acknowledge multiple things. We live in a world where the supply of medicines is from commercial, privately held organisations, and we need to deal with that. They are global monoliths. We have to deal with that. And we are a second-tier market, and we have to deal with that. And none of that is a reason why anything else but the highest ethical standards should be applied by everybody. But it also is it's also just a crushing reality that's the space we're in. And if those companies who have those drugs have not put them forward for medullary thyroid carcinoma in this country, then it should be a cause for us to reflect and say, what is wrong with our system that's not happening, and how do we fix it? Not turn and say, well, no one's applied, because that's a catch-22 if you're interested in pop culture literature from my time.
So Srividya, I'm going to move on to you briefly. So you've got a remarkable insight with your background, as you being a doctor and then a patient and a doctor. And I'm interested just to ask, how difficult was it for you to advocate, as you had to, for genetic testing and targeted treatments while still dealing with an illness and still studying and doing everything else that you were doing?
I would say yes, it was indeed very difficult, and I'm not, of course, my specialty is very different. It's two different areas. And to get my head around all the jargon and getting to understand what best practice was available globally, I jumped onto Facebook forums, and those groups were really helpful to see what trials were out there. And of course, going back to medical literature was then of course, backing myself up, when I approached my oncologist. It was difficult, and to get your head around for a person with no medical literacy would be just mind-boggling, because it's hard for someone with some medical background. Then you can imagine how it would be daunting for someone who has none. And trying to work through the cancer treatment and the diagnosis itself would be so hard. And to then, able to advocate and try to say, ask the question, first of all, it's really hard when you are, as a lot of other speakers said and Caitlin mentioned, it's very hard when you are actually in that relationship as a patient. And for me, it was kind of a deer in the headlight moment. Like, I, of course, like anyone else, it would never be me. But it was that. And to maneuver through those challenges was indeed hard. But then, not every clinician is open to suggestions or, for instance, even suggestions that this is the best practice available in UK or in USA. They may not be all part of trials or running it. So it's very, very tricky. And to know or to be one of those, having the right oncologist and all that, yeah, it definitely matters.
And we know to see change happen that we need to look, where the influences lie, and that often can be in governments and in industry. So from a patient advocate perspective, what do you want to see from both government and industry to make it easier for patients to get diagnosis and treatment with precision oncology?
Time is the essence. Don't wait. Throw everything at first setting itself. In the frontline setting, you've got the best shot at beating the disease and your all efforts. So I think it comes down to, again, looking at what you are going to spend on, say, a person. You're investing in that person, really. So it's not just as, for good outcomes, but as on individual level, that person is playing a very important role in the community. So look at the person as investment in future. And I think that's why in first setting, that's the best option they have. And that should be targeted from the beginning. And at a policy level, I understand. It all comes down to the reservations with finances and so forth. But I think we living in a developed country, I really struggled with that concept. And I was appalled when I was told I have to pay $7,000 a month. And to the best of best people, no one has got cash lying around like that, So it was really difficult. And I would expect and I hope for future that it becomes as a standard practice that whatever trials or say off-label medications are available, they should be offered, or the patient shouldn't be doing all that homework themselves. Yeah. That should be, what.
And Richard, then I'll go to you. Andrew, I'll go to you next.
Yeah, but there are, Switzerland has something called the Named Patient Program, and I don't claim to be an expert in it, but essentially there is an opportunity there. If a clinician wants to prescribe a treatment, that he can put his case forward, and the treatment, it's like the special access scheme here with the TGA, except it comes with funding. And so there is an option. We have to be able to deal with the exceptions. We can't just ignore them.
We've only got about 5 minutes left, so if you've got a question for our amazing panel, pop your hand up and we'll get the microphone to you. So I've got one down here, maybe if you want to come down. But I'm going to ask Andrew, one of the things that I found fascinating, you were saying in the report that you did into blood cancers, you said diagnosis was a key challenge for patients with blood cancers. What was the average time for a diagnosis for people with blood cancer? Because this really surprised me.
Look, I think that firstly I'd emphasise that there are over 120 subtypes of blood cancer.
Meaning that they're all, that means if you're diagnosed with that, it is a particularly rare type then, if you've got 120 different types. That's
right, and some of those can be slightly more straightforward to diagnose than others. There's certainly, we do hear reports, and our patient support team hear those reports of people who have been on the ground, who've sort of gone through a bit of a journey through different specialists and different haematologist teams and different GPs and sometimes particularly with the rarer types, it can even take a couple of years, and that's very challenging for people to be on that journey for that long.
Yeah, I found that amazing. And so one of the things briefly before we go to our question, I wanted just to briefly talk about data collection, about why it's so important. That's one of the recommendations in the report, to make data collection, to really reflect, to look for subtypes of cancer. Why is it so important that we look for those subtypes? Maybe Richard, did you want to talk about that?
I think what we need to understand is that if I look at it from the way back, which is that what you're trying to do is work out the impact of a therapy or a treatment, and you can't do that if you don't know how many people it's treating, where they're treating, and it's everything. I love the expression, "In God we trust, and everybody else bring data," sorry, I probably shouldn't have dropped that one. Anyway, that's you got to know. If you don't know, you're just guessing. You're just wandering around in the dark. And we have. If we do know, then we know if it works.
Exactly. And so, Ariane, I was going to ask you, how important is it to have that information, to have that data, so that then government departments can then make decisions based on knowing how many people have a certain subtype?
Yeah. So I was quite, I've been in this job for just over 12 months, and I was quite shocked when I arrived to find out that we, let alone subtype, but we don't even know what stage people are being diagnosed at, which is incredibly important as well. So we are on a journey at the moment. We're working with states and territories and registries to try and look at how we improve data collection in the system. So and AHW as well, which is one of the recommendations. So we are developing a national data framework, which we really hope will be able to push and drive some of these changes in the system, because at the moment we don't know.
Because it's very blunt just to say that cancer diagnosis without the subtypes, without the staging.
Yeah, so because we don't have the data, we need that data actually to provide advice to government to help inform the decisions that they're making. So yeah, I completely agree. Data is incredibly important to what we're doing at the moment.
Prashant, did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I was just going to build on what Richard was saying, that drug discovery and drug development is often serendipitous, right? So maybe in the primary endpoint, the drug might not work, but there are pre-specified subsets or stratifications where you start looking at populations that suddenly you know that drug is working there, right? So that's one reason why it should be looked at very carefully in drug development. But going back to Ariane's point as well, I think all parties have to be comfortable that you might not have the sample size or the powering of the studies to the extent, because you're talking about very small slivers of patient population. I mean, just to give you an example, MSI High, the first study probably had 16 different cancers and less than 120 patients. And that was the open label single arm study, which FDA later on approved the drug for that indication. So it goes to show the value of looking at those subsets, and it can work.
Okay, we've got a question from Caitlin. Who did you want to ask it to?
Me again. Richard, the mathematician. So we do have ways to find this information already. So I connected with the patient recently who's a mathematician, and in an hour he developed an algorithm and found the best treatment for him by using Google Bard. So I've printed it out, I've got it here, I didn't have time to talk about it myself. If he can use that technology and it's already in there, and this was like reliable because when he actually then chased it up, it was all contraindications, risk factors, most effective, timely, which one, blah, 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 did a cascade in questions. Why can't we just start doing that now? Patients probably can start doing it now. Oncologists better catch up. They could probably use it. It would take them 2 seconds. Yep. That's my first question. And what's stopping us, doing that, I guess, now?
I think I've been rereading Emperor of All Melodies, and that's both a fascinating book, but it's depressing. It's by a guy called Siddhartha Mukherjee, which I think is the best name I've ever heard. And he talks about being at a conference where he said it's like being in two different worlds, where clinical oncologists were talking about treatment and the scientists and researchers were in another room talking about breakthroughs, and they came, they talked, and then they all went home and they never had a conversation. So that this problem of translation, of getting that kind of, and I think AI is going to be right at the peak of this. There is so much that we could learn. And the other point that I wanted to make, and I think it was Tiff who made it, around incrementalism. And, I did something a year or so ago, which apparently people are still watching, which I'm quite thrilled about, which was called a Thought Leader series. And I asked people like John Zalzberg, Ian Fraser, and others, whether we should be more adventurous and more braver in how we did research. And the answer was, well, we sort of could be, but it's not kind of how the system works. And I've asked this question of David, and if I was fair, I'd throw the microphone at him and let him answer it, because it is frustrating that we just sometimes seem to be, and it feeds back into the system that if you're in drug development or drug testing, then you're looking for the safest possible solution. You start off testing at stage 4 cancer patients, you slowly work back the treatment back to stage 1. Everything about it is so conservative. And my idol, Siddhartha Mukherjee, said in an interview I saw him, he said that people who were doing research in the 50s and 60s, and that's not to say that some really bad stuff didn't go down in those times, but they look at the conservative approach of researchers today and sort of shake their heads. As I said, a lot of bad stuff went down in those times, but there's surely a balance between. I think we should give David a chance to reply.
I think it's true, Richard. You do have to think outside the box. I think one thing I learnt covering medicine for so many years for the ABC was that things that were seen as fringe and on the outskirts or outliers then have become standard practice and clinical practice. So you can't always dismiss, so thinking outside the box, that's what science is all about, questioning what is, and you need to ask those brave questions. So did you want to give David something? Did David want to say something?
Can't avoid it.
And then I'm going to quickly go to each panel member, then we're going to wrap up.
Well, I think the more that you gain, the more you've got to lose. And we have gone from the 1950s, when cancer was literally a death sentence, where anything, kids, it was just terrible. That book describes it very well. To a stage where we now got 70% 5-year survival, and I would never want to put anybody at risk without having a good, compelling case for doing that trial. That's why we move through these phases. The thing is, patients who've got incurable disease are like they're in the 1950s. They've got nothing to lose, and I agree. We should have a tailored risk system where our appetite is greatest, where we've got the most to gain.
Yep, I
Yeah,
agree.
well said. So look, the panel time's it's just flown, absolutely flown. But I want to go to each of our panel members, just to one last thing to sum up, just one message that each of them want you to take away, their most important thing. So Prashant, I'll start with you. What's the key thing from industry, your point of view, that you want this audience to take away?
Yeah, I think it was very clear throughout the day that there are all these stakeholders involved, right? And Liz DeSimore is here. She always says that don't admire the problem too long. You need to come to solutions. And I think the idea of each one of us as stakeholders, we cannot be static. We need to move our positions also. Whether it's the combination idea that you said that 2 pharma companies need to figure out a way to work together to make sure that the drug is available. Government has to embrace uncertainty and look at value in a different way. Everybody has to look at the solutions in a different way and try to walk the position. So next year, hopefully we come and talk about not struggles of patients, but success stories, how easy it was to get access to medicine. Right?
That sounds good.
So that would be a wonderful day.
Ariane, what about you from your key message from the departmental point of view that you would like people to know from where you sit, from what you do day to day?
Yeah, so I think precision medicine is the future for cancer care. So we are absolutely conscious of that, and it's about how do we move there both in a cost-effective but safe, ethical way, and that's really what we're grappling with at the moment. And then I think the only other thing I'd share is that many people know that we're going to be hopefully the first country in the world to eliminate cervical cancer. So I say to my team, that's one down, now we've got the rest to go.
Love that. That deserves a round of applause, I think. Because the more we eliminate cancer, the less we need to advocate for treatments for patients. And Andrew?
I just think for some rarer cancers and blood cancers and others, we can't always be waiting for the really sort of comprehensive trials. We need to be a little bit more brave, and we need to be listening to patients about their experiences, and particularly their experiences on trials and with those drugs, even if they've been overseas.
Thank you. And Srividya?
Again, I would reinforce time. Time is the essence, and the concept of equity. Not just one person. Think about, you could save the sea of turtles. That's what I would say. Always, that's what the picture should be like. Not the common ones, but the rarer ones. And that's why we're different. And it's not one glove fits all. And that's where we're leading genomics. Yeah.
And Richard, your last words for you? Not last words ever, but last words today. Time's up. So
I wrote an op-ed early this year called The Invisible Health Crisis around the PBS and the availability of medicines in this country. And the point that I was making is that if you're diagnosed with cancer and you go to your oncologist and he reaches into his toolkit and he pulls out a drug, you just assume it's the best one, but it's not. It's the best one he's got in his toolkit. And the invisible crisis is what's being put in the toolkit. And we need to be incredibly careful and incredibly active right now that we don't end up on a path that looks a lot like I was in New Zealand at the weekend. And you don't want to be there.
So please give our panel a big round of applause. Everyone stay.